The faces of the two interrogating officers were gaunt and tired. The evidence in the police's possession was still insufficient, and they were far from certain in their conclusions. I asked Kevin to roll up his sleeve and noticed several fresh scabs on his forearm. His hand was cold, and his palm was sweaty. I jabbed the needle in forcefully. When I withdrew it, a drop of blood the size of a pea oozed from his fingertip. Kevin didn't flinch or pull his hand away, nor did he so much as frown. Instead, he politely nodded at me. I've taken blood samples from hundreds, maybe thousands of people, but very few showed as little fear of pain as he did. As I prepared to fill out the personal information for the blood sample, I paused briefly and handed him the confirmation form and a pen. Here, sign this. Kevin took the pen with his left hand and signed his name. I glanced up at the officer in charge of the interrogation, and he was staring wide-eyed at Kevin's left hand. The wound on the left side of Jessica's neck was deeper than the one on the right, strongly suggesting that the perpetrator was left-handed. Kevin claimed that on the night Jessica went missing, he had been working overtime at the office all night to submit a report on time the next morning. The police grew suspicious of the wounds on his arm. Initially, Kevin said he had scratched himself, but after hesitating for a few seconds, he changed his story, saying that Jessica often scratched him while helping him with an itch, and she might have accidentally scratched too hard. The next morning, he became extremely anxious, worried that the police interrogation would affect his work. He started complaining loudly that he hadn't taken leave from work. I've got a ton of work to do, and my boss must be going nuts. When the police asked him why he had been stuck in an entry-level office job for so long, Kevin's face turned red as he retorted, "What's wrong with being an employee? I ranked first in the city in my calculus exam back then." The officers flattered him a bit, and he lamented, "What's the use? It's not even worth as much as those graduates from fourth-tier schools struggling out there." Once he began to lower his guard, the police brought up Diego. "How many bottles of alcohol did you have with Diego that night?" "It's been a long time since I last saw him," Kevin responded quickly. "Didn't he commit suicide?" Kevin finally slipped. The circumstances surrounding Diego's death were still under investigation, and the police hadn't released the information publicly. Until the police pulled out the surveillance camera footage from the apartment complex, Kevin finally admitted that he had gone to Diego's place that night. He suspected Diego of being involved with his fiancée, and when he arrived at Diego's apartment and saw him sitting alone drinking, he immediately left. In fact, initially, we couldn't be completely certain that the person on the camera was Kevin. But because he slipped up, the evidence began to come together. The DNA test results for Kevin came in. His DNA matched that found on Diego's lower body, on the network cable, and under Jessica's fingernails. Logically, as Jessica's fiancé, it was normal for his DNA to be found on her body, and that alone couldn't be used as evidence to convict him. However, Kevin couldn't deny the DNA found on the network cable. He admitted that he killed Diego to avenge Jessica, but denied being the one who killed Jessica. Though Kevin and Diego had been friends since childhood, Kevin had always felt inferior to Diego. He vividly remembered once, when they were young, getting into an argument with Diego, and his parents had forced him to apologize to Diego just because Diego's parents were influential. After admitting to planning Diego's murder, Kevin's composure began to crumble, though his eyes still held a spark, and there was no trace of regret on his face. The tech team had to recreate the crime scene from that night, tracing the movement of Kevin's and Jessica's phones. It was confirmed that Kevin had taken Jessica's phone to Diego's apartment. It wasn't until then that Kevin bowed his head and admitted that he had killed Jessica and staged the scene to frame Diego. Kevin believed he had prepared thoroughly and thought that, at most, the investigation would conclude that Diego committed suicide out of guilt. But no matter how cunning his scheme, The truth remained in the evidence. It couldn't be distorted. During the interrogation, Kevin never stopped trying to justify himself. He said he only threatened Jessica with a knife, and she unexpectedly lunged for it, resulting in her being stabbed in the stomach by accident. He even justified murdering Diego and framing him by saying that Diego betrayed me first, and that he decided to send those adulterers to hell together. Kevin claimed he was innocent, as though he were the one who had been wronged. Jessica had loved Kevin deeply. During their university years, she treated him well, always paying for their dates or shopping trips. After graduation, Kevin got a job as a civil servant at the health department. Jessica was a sweet but stubborn girl. According to her parents, she was pretty straightforward and realistic. She thought that after graduating, they should naturally get jobs, get married, and have children. When Jessica got pregnant, their parents met and set a wedding date. Under the pressure from both sets of parents, Kevin didn't dare voice his objections. In truth, he deeply resisted this marriage. After 2 years of work, Kevin had experienced the frustrations that came with being a civil servant. Kevin believed that in terms of education, talent, interpersonal skills, he was no less capable than anyone else. Yet his workplace focused all their attention on 2 new hires, one of whom was an important candidate, being groomed for promotion. This was a major blow to Kevin. He thought that the success of those 2 was because they had connections, whereas he was alone, with no one to back him up. To try to get promoted, he borrowed money from his colleagues to buy a crate of Mau Tai liquor as a gift for his superiors. In the end, he still failed. Kevin complained, "Without connections, it's useless." Jessica advised him to take things more lightly and not place too much emphasis on career gains and titles. Kevin, however, thought that Jessica was of no help to his career advancement. The officer in charge of interrogating Kevin had met one of his university friends. That person mentioned that Kevin had always liked to take shortcuts since college. Before graduation, one of Kevin's classmates had applied for a position at the health department. During the evaluation process, the classmate was disqualified, and he later found out through connections that someone had reported him for misconduct. Not long after, Kevin signed a contract to work at the health department. No one could confirm whether he was the one who made the report. But after that, most of his classmates began to despise him, believing he would use any means to achieve his goals. By chance, Kevin came to know the daughter of a department leader. He felt that she didn't look down on him, and his feelings started to change. He longed to rely on the leader's daughter to change his fate. When Kevin found out that Jessica was pregnant, he considered confronting her directly, or getting married and then divorced. But that would affect his plan to pursue the department leader's daughter. In this small community, any scandal, like a noisy divorce, would ruin his reputation for life, and he wouldn't be able to make a career there afterward. Kevin couldn't come up with a reason to break up with Jessica, and he was afraid she would make a big fuss. So he gradually started acting cold towards her. Kevin figured that this month he had only been intimate with Jessica once, during her safe period, and afterward he went on a business trip. Thus, he assumed that he had been cheated on, and that the child could only be from Jessica's ex-boyfriend, Diego. On the day they were supposed to register their marriage, Kevin lied to Jessica, saying there was an urgent work matter, just so he could take the department leader's daughter out for a meal. That day, Jessica had a huge argument with him. She insisted that they must register on the following Monday, and Kevin should arrange to take the day off. Kevin's indifference made Jessica suspicious, and she began looking into his movements and his bank account. On the weekend night, the 2 of them laid everything bare in front of each other. When accused of cheating, Kevin retaliated, saying that it was Jessica who had been unfaithful first. Breaking up would come with a heavy price, and Kevin didn't want to bear it. After thinking about it for an entire night, he developed the intent to kill. That afternoon, Jessica called Kevin, asking him to meet her at the park where they had met before to have a final discussion. At first, both of them were holding back, reminiscing about old memories, and the atmosphere was quite harmonious. After 10 p.m., they walked deeper into the woods, and the water bottle Jessica was holding was already empty. The bottle had been spiked with sleeping pills by Kevin. Jessica said she was completely innocent, suggesting that they call Diego so the three of them could have an honest conversation. She even said they could do a DNA test once the baby was born. Kevin tried to probe, saying he wasn't ready for a baby right now and that they could talk about it later. Jessica broke down. She cried while threatening Kevin, saying she would cause a scene at his workplace. Emotions flaring, Jessica slapped Kevin across the face. Kevin used his left hand to grab Jessica by the throat, forcing her to the ground. His right hand covered her mouth, preventing her from screaming for help. Jessica's lip was injured. Her teeth tore the inner lining of her mouth, and after a while her face turned bruised and bloody. After a minute or two, when Jessica stopped struggling, Kevin used both hands to squeeze her neck tightly, his fingernails leaving crescent-shaped marks on her throat. Kevin continued to apply pressure, and Jessica's hyoid bone broke. She became completely still. Jessica's pupils dilated, and petechiae appeared in her eyes. After killing Jessica, Kevin felt no worry or remorse. His only focus was covering up the truth. He took Jessica's phone and wallet then, in the middle of the night, went to Diego's house, claiming he wanted to have a few drinks to drown his sorrows. While drinking, Diego used a glass cup, while Kevin used a disposable paper cup. Diego kept trying to explain that nothing had happened between him and Jessica. When Diego went to the bathroom, Kevin added powdered sleeping pills into Diego's drink. After Diego fell asleep, Kevin grabbed the paper cup, pulled down Diego's pants, and used physical stimulation to collect Diego's seminal fluid. Once done, Kevin straightened Diego's clothes, picked up a network cable, and strangled Diego until he stopped moving. Kevin had looked up instructions online on how to make a hangman's noose, and he used it to hang Diego by the window. After that, Kevin accessed Jessica's WeChat, deleting any unpleasant conversation between them, as well as the messages between Jessica and Diego. He used a pillowcase to wipe down Jessica's phone and placed it beside Diego's phone on the nightstand. Kevin then returned to the wooded area in the park, undressed Jessica, and staged the scene as a rape murder. Kevin stood beside her body, using a knife to cut open Jessica's abdomen. He later told the police that he hated the baby. If it hadn't been for the child, he might have easily left Jessica behind. The murder weapon was the key piece of evidence in the chain of proof for the case. Without it, there was still a gap in the investigation. The temperature in the interrogation room was moderate, and the lights were bright. Kevin's face appeared a bit pale. His hairstyle was still neatly in place, and his stubble had grown out quite a bit. Even after admitting to premeditated murder, Kevin still justified himself, even trying to maintain his dignity. The police brought all the sharp objects from Kevin's house to the interrogation room, laying them out in a row on the table. I wasn't feeling optimistic. If he had thrown the knife into the river, it would be time-consuming and labor-intensive to retrieve it, with no guarantee of success. Even if we managed to recover the knife, we wouldn't necessarily be able to test for DNA on it. My colleague caught my meaning, skirted around the array of potential murder weapons, and changed the subject, asking Kevin something different. We noticed that whenever his workplace was mentioned, Kevin's eyes would grow vacant. We rushed to Kevin's office, pried open his desk drawer, and found a dagger inside. When we entered the interrogation room again, Kevin had his back to the door, his shirt clinging to his body, with a large damp patch across his back. After a while, he looked up and said, "I'm hungry. I want something to eat." We found Jessica's DNA in the crevice of the knife handle. It was a beautiful folding knife. Perhaps Kevin couldn't bring himself to throw it away. After the interrogation was over, Kevin said, "I want to know whose child it was." I pushed the DNA test result in front of him. Science doesn't lie. Kevin had killed his own biological son with his own hands. He bowed his head, his lips trembling slightly, and he stopped offering any further justification. Although the case had been solved, I still had to prepare a forensic report and all the other documents for the case. There was no time to rest. Evidence has to be utilized to its fullest potential to prevent regret and ensure that no victim dies unjustly. I thought of the department leader's daughter, the girl Kevin had sacrificed everything to pursue. In truth, she didn't even like him. Kevin was just one of many suitors. Kevin was very generous towards this well-off girl, not hesitating to spend money, often gifting her with small, exquisite items. She had a decent impression of Kevin, thinking he was talented, mature, and funny, and she appreciated that he wasn't always hovering around her. When she was bored, they could go out for a meal, which made her feel comfortable. Every week, Kevin wrote her poems, something she really liked. However, Kevin's behavior was so perfect that it made her hesitate. I strive for perfection, but I don't trust something that appears too perfect. I have to admit, she was truly a smart girl. Or perhaps from the moment Kevin developed his malicious intent, there was no turning back for him. No matter how cleverly he schemed, it could never succeed. A perfect crime? He was deluding himself. Kevin thought that he could have it all after orchestrating this perfect deception, and indeed he had succeeded for a while. His habitual deception led him to refuse to give up, even when facing setbacks. During police interrogations, he kept lying to hide his crimes, but it was all in vain. While Jessica had been deceived again and again during her life, in death, her body revealed the truth. But there was one thing that Dr. Liu Babai, the forensic examiner, couldn't shake. He suspected that Kevin had been lying to himself. From the start, he must have known that the child was his. Working at the health department, he certainly understood such basic medical knowledge. Someone who had deceived so many people couldn't even spare himself. The impression Kevin left on me: cruel, greedy, with no moral boundaries. But from another perspective, he still doesn't qualify as having antisocial personality disorder. The character names and details of the case have been altered, so perhaps the specific details of the case are only known to Kevin, the police, and the author. There are many details that the police simply can't reveal to the public. As for the kind of physical stimulation used to obtain Diego's seminal fluid and leave DNA behind, I guess everyone can just use their imagination.